Professor Noam Chomsky, thank you for speaking to Ceasefire. My first question is, in a very positive review of your book, Fateful Triangle, in 1984, the late Edward Said wrote that the irony is that Chomsky does not reflect theoretically on what he does. He just does it. So, on the one hand, he leaves us to suppose that telling the truth is a simple matter, while, on the other hand, he compiles masses of evidence showing that no one really can deal with the facts. How can we then suppose that one man can tell the truth? Do you agree with this criticism? And is there a reason why you do not reflect theoretically, to use his phrase, on what you do?
I don't call what I do theoretical reflection, but it's just as theoretical as anything else in the field. The reason I don't call it theoretical is it's too thin. I mean, in other areas, like, say, my professional work, yes, I talk about theories, but what's called theory in the social sciences, public commentary, and so on, is at best common sense. I don't think there's any theoretical depth. So Edward was an old and close friend. We often talked about this. But I just don't see any theories. So I prefer not to use the honorific term. But I don't see how these descriptive accounts are less theoretical than what's called theory.
In the recent wave of protests in the Middle East, those in Iraq have been largely ignored. For instance, on the 25th of February, 15 people were killed, and there have been reports of journalists getting tortured in a violent crackdown. At the same time, it seems that the electoral system that has been bequeathed by the occupation is entrenching sectarianism in the country. And my question is, in this context, do you think there are prospects for a peaceful, democratic Iraq?
First of all, mild correction. I don't think the electoral system was bequeathed by the occupation. It was created in opposition to the occupation. It's worth remembering that the U.S. tried very hard from the beginning to prevent a functioning parliamentary system from developing. Tried to block elections. When it couldn't block them, it tried to manipulate them. Couldn't manipulate them, it sort of tried to influence the outcomes in some other way. So there is a kind of a parliamentary system, but it's a little bit misleading to say that the occupation bequeathed it. It, in fact, tried to prevent it. Of course, the official story is different, but it's pretty clear from the events. Anyhow, the system such as it is it's a pretty authoritarian system with lots of internal conflicts, not clear how they're going to be resolved. The country was left as a total disaster. I mean, hundreds, thousands of people killed, millions of refugees, a lot of the educated classes fled, destroyed, the ones who would participate in rebuilding the country. There's a Sunni Shia conflict was created. I mean, you know, there had been tensions, but nothing very severe. And as a result of the occupation, it just blew out of control, became massive. By now, say, Baghdad is fairly quiet, but the reason is it's mostly ethnically cleansed. The groups have been forcefully separated. And how all that will be overcome is hard to say. Incidentally, there's also uprisings in the Kurdish areas in Kurdistan against the also quite harsh authoritarian regime up there. There's demonstrations, protests, effort to get minimal freedoms, freedom of press, and so on. So the whole area is in turmoil. I mean, it was really hit by a sledgehammer. And how Iraqis will reconstruct something out of this is not easy to say.
You have said that states are violent entities, constrained only by outside force or their own populations, and also that there are no good states. Is this the case even with emerging countries in the south like Bolivia and Venezuela? And do you think there are prospects for a peaceful world that is composed of states?
I mean, if Bolivia became a major regional power, I'd expect it to act violently. States are, it's not a simple principle, but by and large, there's a tendency for states to be violent to the extent that they have power, meaning to the extent that they have freedom of action. If the freedom of action, as you quoted, can be either lack of external or internal constraints. That's a pretty typical property of states, and I don't think whether that happens or not depends on what the states are like. So if a state becomes really internally democratic, responsive to popular will, not under the control of concentrated domestic power of some sort, then people aren't necessarily aren't violent. They'd rather live in peace. So it might be constrained. Actually, things change over time. I mean, take, say, Europe. For centuries, Europe was the most savage place in the world, in large measure as a result of the policy of state formation. Imposition of state structures is a pretty violent process. The state structure itself, with rare exceptions, does not correspond to the nature of the society on which it's imposed. Societies have to be forced together into a mold, even if they're very distinct. Iraq's a perfectly good case. The British put together pieces that had nothing to do with each other, so that tends to be tension. And that's true that was true right through the history of modern Europe. It was an unusually savage place, in fact developed a culture and technology of savagery which helped it conquer the world. And finally, in 1945, Europe settled into what's probably a long, maybe permanent peace. The reason is pretty straightforward. The Europeans recognized they just could not continue with this. If there was a move to a third world war, it would be the end. I mean, the level of destructiveness, violence, and so on had reached such a peak that it just couldn't be used anymore. So yes, now Europe is pretty much peaceful. On the other hand, if you look around the world, the conflicts that are raging all over are to a very large extent a result of the imposition of nation-state structures by European imperialism on regions where they have little, if any, relation to the interests and needs of the populations, so that the effects of European state creation are still being felt in terrible conflicts all over. Can this change? Yes, it can change the way it has changed in Europe. It can change if the states themselves internally change in such ways that the populations are unwilling to support violent action and press for peaceful measures. If you look at popular opinion, that's usually what people want. I mean, so take the United States. A considerable majority of the population thinks that the United Nations, not the United States, should take the lead in international conflicts. In fact, the majority even support giving up the veto at the Security Council and following the will of the majority, even if the U.S. doesn't like it. I mean, those are kind of unthinkable notions among policy elites, but it is popular opinion, similarly on many other issues. So there's a hope, and I think state structures should and can, in fact, be simply eroded. I mean, to an extent, that's happening in Europe. So state borders are less sharp than they were, say, a century ago. You can cross from one place to another freely. There's more interaction. State systems are still there, but in a less sharp and harsh form than in earlier years, and it may continue. Also, there's a process inside Europe of a kind of regionalization, more developed in some countries than others, but say Spain, Catalonia's fair amount of autonomy, Basque Country as well, other regions may move in the same direction. In the United Kingdom, Wales, and Scotland, there's been a level of devolution, which is, again, kind of weakening state structures, all of which is a good thing, I think. So there can be changes.
Obama's election brought about much rhetoric of post-racial societies in the West. Do you think his election has significantly improved prospects for African Americans and others in the US? And how significant a role do you think race still plays today?
You want to see what role race plays? Take a look at the prisons, the poverty statistics, unemployment, and so on. It plays an enormous role. Just say the prison system. Prisons have exploded in the United States in the last 30 years. Back to about 1980, incarceration rates in the United States were pretty much the same as other industrial countries, a little toward the high end, but not off the spectrum. And now it's 5 to 10 times as high. The prisons are populated overwhelmingly with African Americans, secondly Hispanics, mostly men, though the number of women is also increasing. It's not because of crime, and crime rates haven't increased. What's happening is there's a kind of a superfluous population, which is created by the very conscious, deliberate policies of hollowing out of production, meaning sending production abroad, which is fine for investors and managers and owners, but no good for the working class. Now, there's such a close race-class correlation in the U.S. that the effect of hollowing out production has been disproportionately felt by African Americans, and so their level of unemployment is much higher, and there's nothing for them, you know. So huge numbers end up being sent off to the prisons. I think the probability for a young black male that he'll end up in prison is higher than that he'll go to college. That's one residue of racism and slavery, which is still extant, and there are many others. As I mentioned, poverty statistics, unemployment statistics, and so on. I mean, Obama's election was a kind of a psychological shot in the arm, and important in that respect. But it really didn't have much in the way of objective change. Very little, in fact.
My next question is, the emerging movement against public sector cuts in Britain has so far been run along largely consensual decision-making lines without any clear leadership. But some have criticized it for lacking effectiveness due to this method. Often, for example, meetings can run for hours without decisions being taken because no one wants to assume authority. In your experience as an activist, how do you balance efficiency with anarchist principles?
I mean, it is true of participatory systems. They tend to be deliberative, as they should be. What often happens, unfortunately, is that a small segment which is willing to persist can handle the boredom